We're circling back a little bit, my friends, because we never finished our sermon series on the charge thanks to those weeks, well, really 1 week of snow. So we're circling back and we're finishing that sermon series. It's about the words of the charge that we say at the end of the worship service every Sunday. So a little bit of a refresher. You'll remember that the charge comes primarily from the epistles, from these writings of the early church. And during this series, we've looked at verses from 1 Thessalonians and Romans. We also could have added in 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, or Ephesians. And then each week, we've had paired with it a gospel reading, because I think it's important for us to see that the work and the beliefs of the early church that we find in these epistles and that we also find in our charge, that those were inspired by the words and the ministry and even the clear instruction of Jesus Christ. This morning, our text from Matthew is a good starting place before we turn to Romans. In Matthew 5, we hear Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount teaching on the way those who follow him should navigate their enemies. The world would say, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but Jesus says that that's just too easy. If you love those who love you, even the tax collectors and the Gentiles can do that. No, the people who follow Jesus must love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. Jesus calls for something much more radical, much more countercultural, and much more difficult. Loving your neighbor, that seems doable enough, but loving your enemies, that's hard. And praying for those who are out to get you, that's even harder. But Jesus says clearly, this is the way he wants his followers to go. This is the way he wants his disciples to live and move. So then we flip over to Romans and we can see the way that Paul picks up on this idea and is now fleshing this out for his readers in the early days of the church. Bless those who persecute you, he says. Bless them, don't curse them. This is the mark of the Christian community, a community that follows Jesus and doesn't operate by the ways of the world, but operates with grace. Blessings, not curses. Love, not hate. Now, instead of trying to cover everything that's said in these verses in Romans, I want to zoom in on verses 17 through 21. Because up to this point, Paul has written and focused a lot on holding fast to what is good. We spent the first couple weeks of this series kind of looking at that idea. But here he focuses in on shunning evil. And he starts by offering an initial warning not to repay anyone evil for evil. And then he shifts into more positive territory. Take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Essentially, he's saying, attend to the things that are good for all people. Then comes a really important verse. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And that might sound like Paul's being wishy-washy. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you. But this isn't Paul being wishy-washy. This is an acknowledgement that peace takes more than one party. It takes more than one side wanting peace, and so sometimes peace isn't possible. Even if we want it really badly, it can't happen if the other side doesn't want it or isn't willing to participate in it. And so Paul is acknowledging that no one has the power to make peace unilaterally. But what we can do comes next. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. Paul's giving a really forceful reminder that the role of enacting justice belongs to God and God alone. God alone is the only proper agent of justice. This is not our work to do. But in place of wrath or enacting our own justice, Paul then says this: if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. Do not overcome evil with more evil, but overcome it with good. In Paul's eyes, the appropriate response when we feel this temptation to avenge or bring wrath upon someone, the appropriate response is to provide for our enemies' needs and leave the rest up to God. Now, that's what I would call the kill them with kindness approach, but there's a lot of wisdom in it. Because when we return evil for evil, the evil wins. Augustine of Hippo, he's an early Christian theologian. He's considered one of the church fathers. He said this hundreds upon hundreds of years ago, and it still rings true. Do you want to overcome evil with evil? To conquer malice with malice? Then there will be two wicked people, both of whom have to be overcome. Friends, the way to overcome evil is with good, not with more evil. And notice that there isn't talk in here about a reward. Other places in Scripture, we find this idea that good is rewarded by God. But here, doing good is not about gaining some reward. Good is what is called for by Christ. Good is what is called for by grace. And notice again that this is not talking about being nice to our neighbors. This is talking about the ways we navigate our enemies. This is talking about taking care of our enemies. And friends, it feels worth saying in light of all that's been happening in our country, that if this is how we are to treat our enemies, how then do we think we are supposed to treat immigrants? Or anyone else for that matter? With food when they're hungry? With drink when they're thirsty? Living peaceably with all. When we commit to following Christ, when we commit to living lives that are transformed by grace, we are called to live in a new reality. And that new reality is often at odds with the world around us. You see, as human beings built into us, we have this very natural temptation when we feel wronged or insulted to take up the task of avenging that wrong. But Paul reminds us here that that is not our job. If there's any wrath to be administered or doled out, we are to leave that up to God. As human beings, we are far too prone to deciding someone's an enemy because they displease us or they make us feel threatened. But our job as followers of Christ is to live into this new reality and to embody Christ's peace and reconciliation. When we overcome evil with good, our good deeds have the power to burn away the hate within us. And maybe, just maybe, then there's more and more hate that gets burnt away and we can make our way to peace. Maybe this all sounds a little too Pollyanna to you. Overcome evil with good, leave the wrath to God, live peaceably with all. How is that possible in our world as it is today? It sounds too optimistic, it sounds too good to be true, and yet this is what God calls us to live in harmony with one another, to not repay evil for evil, to overcome evil with good and rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Friends, even if it sounds too good to be true, even if it sounds too optimistic, it can't hurt to try. The world is crying out for peace, it's crying out for harmony, and when the ways of the world are not peace and not harmony, still it is our job to hold to these countercultural ways, to hold to the ways of Christ, to hold to the ways of grace and mercy and peace. How many of you have heard about the monks and their walk for peace? Have any of you guys been, thank you, I'm so glad you know about this. If you don't, of course, a walk for peace is a part of this larger tradition. It's a nonviolent act to raise awareness for peace and compassion and understanding. This particular walk for peace actually finished up this week. They made their way into the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., but it was started by 19 Buddhist monks from a temple in Fort Worth, Texas, in October. Now, it's February, friends. In October, they started walking 2,300 miles from Fort Worth to Washington, D.C., to call for peace and compassion, and they finally finished up on Tuesday. And as they walked, they weren't making political statements, they weren't taking sides, they were walking at what they called a meditative pace. And they were carrying with them a message of peace and the call for others to aim for peace in their own lives, to cultivate peace in their own lives and in their own little corner of the world. And if you're on social media and you didn't see any of this, you need to go back. You need to look up the Walk for Peace. They posted updates every day, and they were really beautiful. And remember how cold, it's terribly cold, we've all been complaining about the last few weeks? They were walking in the snow, on freezing roads, in frigid temperature for miles and miles every day. And people were lining the streets in those same frigid temperatures to see them walk by every day, and they were holding out flowers for them as they passed. And what I found really beautiful was that all these crowds that would gather on the road to watch them walk by, they would often hold silence as they came through. And so it became this really prayerful, meditative march of peace across the country. It was inspiring to watch and so moving to see their dedication to this message of peace. It took them 108 days to make the journey. And I don't know about you all, but a lot of times I look at my phone at night, I'll look at the news, I'll look at social media, and there's a lot of negativity and hate and anger to be found in those places. And so as the Walk for Peace was going on, they started showing up on my feed as well, so that in the midst of all of the negativity and the hate, there was this bright, shining light of the Walk for Peace. And so I found myself so drawn to the way they were moving quietly and peacefully across our country. In many ways, it felt like water in a dry and thirsty land. The pace of their footsteps was this quiet, steady drumbeat of peace. And if we are looking for a good example of what it looks like to overcome evil with good, I think the Walk for Peace gives us one. I'm not telling you need to go walk halfway across the country, but what they were doing, it wasn't particularly loud or flashy. It wasn't even all that exciting. It's putting one foot in front of the other. Day after day, step by step, praying with our feet and staying committed to peace and the way of Christ and the goodness of God, instead of this human temptation for revenge or wrath or hatred or evil. Friends, we can choose a different way. We can choose to live as Jesus called us to live. We can choose to bless those who persecute us and live in harmony with each other. And if our enemies are hungry, we feed them. And if they're thirsty, we give them a drink. We can leave the judgment up to God. We can choose Christ's way. Now, I know that's a harder path. Choosing Christ's way is never meant to be the easy way. But this is what Jesus asks of us. This is what God asks of us, and this is what the Spirit enables us to do. And friends, I believe we can do it with God's help. So today and every day, let's go out into the world in peace, quietly, faithfully, filled with Christ's grace. Amen.